Most guys were just pretty much intimidated. They lost the fight before they even got hit. Most guys. I knew the art of skullduggery. These guys, I knew how to beat these guys psychologically before I even got in the ring with them.
Taking a long time to get to his feet.
Yeah, that's a bad sign. He had Kanakov on the ground position.
I think he said something there that the referee might be looking to give him a yellow card for timidity. We do have the yellow card system here in ACB, so that would be a point deduction.
Wow.
He's talking to his corner.
That's a
as well.
referee
That's
stoppage, right? Yeah.
That is a referee stoppage.
Wait a minute, timidity? Oh, yeah, look at that. That is a rule. Huh. Now, why in a sport as aggressive as fighting would you need a rule against timidity? Like, surely both guys would show up willing to fight and be aggressive, right?
Timidity again, and Sarah just falling down. The referee's already warned him.
If you don't stand up, you're disqualified.
You hear the referee.
Stand up, you're disqualified.
Sarah cannot get to his feet. This is over.
Okay, well that's awkward. Anyway, it turns out the human brain basically has 3 different responses to stress. So the first and most obvious one, and the one that they're obviously there being paid to do, is to fight.
Mr. Anderson.
The next response the brain has to stress, and probably the one that comes up the most often, is just running away.
こんな化け物をやっつける策がさらにあるのかジョジョ
ああ、あるぜ。こっちも足を使うんだ。逃げるんだよ。
And so lastly, we have the freeze response. So today we're going to go a little bit into why does this response exist, what does it look like when it shows up or manifests, and why does it show up in fighters of all peoples. So the first thing you need to understand when you're examining the phenomenon of fighters freezing up or refusing to fight during their fights is that they are human. As much as they might appear superhuman or like Greek gods cast into marble statues, they do have a mammalian brain, and a mammalian brain comes with a few interesting evolutionary quirks by default. See, when mammals began our development, we were prey animals. Freezing up and being as still and silent as possible is a classic prey strategy to try and avoid detection. And like it or not, during the age of the dinosaurs, we were all prey animals. And while we have come a long way since then, anyone who's been around fighting long enough can tell you that all it takes is the right amount of stress and trauma to knock the brain right back to its most simplistic settings. Another thing to keep in mind is that freezing or timidity is a fairly common behavior across the animal kingdom. The reason for that is that the risk of bodily damage is just way too great a cost for animals out in the wild to be just constantly attacking each other. And this survival mechanism is actually at the root of why fighters quit mid-fight or look for an excuse to get out of the fight with their ego intact if they don't want to admit that they don't want to keep fighting anymore. So now that we know why freezing exists, let's look at how fighters prepare themselves to deal with this response and how they can even weaponize this against their opponents. The first and most obvious way fighters train themselves to deal with the stress of fighting is by gradual stress inoculation. By gradually exposing themselves to harder forms of training, they build up their psychological and neurological resistance to stress and even rewire their brains to act technically and efficiently instead of relying on the extremely poor default network that humans come with when it comes to fighting.
I mean, look at this guy. This is bizarre stuff. Almost looks like a Rock'em Sock'em robot and timber.
This step is often overlooked by tough guys or people who just want to get in there, with the predictable results being that they inevitably waste massive amounts of energy and are laughably ineffective actually at either defending themselves or hurting their opponent. So what you're watching here is Jimmy Smith versus Tony Moscow, and it is obvious that Jimmy Smith did not prepare himself physically or mentally for the stress of fighting.
Well, you know, tell you what, Moscow does a good job of keeping his composure while all this is going on. He doesn't get into the brawl, stands back, measures the man, and comes in with a pretty good right hand.
Just to make the juxtaposition really obvious, let's compare Jimmy Smith to some of the athletes that have spent their entire lives reconditioning their brains, their reflexes, and their neural responses to stress in order to optimize for efficiency. So this is Muay Thai legend Samart Payakaroon. He's one of the many Muay Thai legends, actually, that has captured a boxing title. This is him defending his WBC Super Bantamweight Championship belt. And as you can see, his reaction time and distance management and just ability to remain calm under the stress of a crowd and an opponent who is directly in his face is remarkable. Another example of a fighter so well conditioned they can remain seemingly unbothered by the highest levels of stress is Vasily Lomachenko. Now, Vasily not only keeps perfect control over his motor skills, he specifically selects movement patterns designed to force the freeze response out of his opponents. Like here against Roman Martinez, where we can already see the freeze response in Roman, and we're only into the second round here. Now, Roman is no bum. He retired with a 34-3 record, and this was his 6th time fighting for this version of a world title alone. And honestly, Roman himself probably isn't sure why he feels paralyzed, but Loma absolutely is. See, Loma takes advantage of one of the 2 ways that a fighter can manipulate the opponent's nervous system against themselves, which is to overwhelm them with options. Even an extremely well-conditioned fighter is vulnerable to paralysis by analysis.
And now Peppering doubling up on the jab. And following it up with a straight left hand. Lomachenko is putting out an exhibition in this round.
And you spoke of his chance to make history tonight. Now you can see.
Another one.
You can see why his promoter was not scared to put him into a world title fight.
Left hand.
And once this mental state is inflicted, it's basically impossible to stop it until the trauma, or in this case the fight, is over. So the brain has to pick one of the 3 stress reaction options, and running away isn't an option.
He likes to bring an end to opponents in quick fashion, and Curtis Harper has walked out of the ring.
Wait, what?
I cannot believe this.
I've never seen this before.
He walked out of the ring.
He's not fighting this guy.
He walked out of the ring.
The brain can't figure out how to fight because it's being overloaded with way too much information too quickly. So the only option it has left is to hope that by not moving or showing aggression, the conflict will stop. And this is a pretty decent option out in the wild where most things don't want to fight to the death, and anything that would definitely eat you would have its chase instinct activated by you running, even if it had been uninterested in you otherwise. And unfortunately in a fight, the opponent isn't going anywhere. If you freeze in place, you may as well be a heavy bag, and boxers are very, very good at hitting bags.
Thank you to Lomachenko when he decided to turn pro.
Lomachenko landing another bomb with the left hand. Another bomb! Rocky standing tall, that goes down!
And this brings us to the second option that fighters use when it comes to triggering a freeze response in their opponents, which is instead of throwing the entire bag of tricks at an opponent, they pick a small number of options that work really, really well together, and then they just reinforce that with as much raw power as they can produce. See, if the risk of taking massive blunt force trauma is too heavily skewed, the brain won't even entertain the notion of trying to fight. All it will do is look for the fastest way out it can find with the minimum amount of damage. Like Mike said,
They lost the fight before they even got hit, most guys.
And he's absolutely right, not bragging. And that's because underneath all the internal dialogue that the ego constantly runs like a ticker tape for us, it would take your subconscious mind about 2 seconds to figure out you have roughly the same odds of dominating a physical contest with prime Mike Tyson as you do an annoyed elephant. In fact, this strategy works so well, some fighters opt to double down and focus all their efforts on a single high percentage technique, and they become almost one-handed, or in some cases, one-legged.
这场比赛确实是一个世纪，所以某种意义上占有可能心理上的一种优势。一个连续组合也直接有命中，直接命中了这个头部。4个，5个，同一角度，马特的这个手臂已经完全红了，漂亮。 这个腿啊，就是非常的沉重，而且非常型啊，好像一个坦克一样，它并不是那种钢条式的体型。对，亚特看来连续对同一个地方进行持续的这个重腿攻击，你看这种风格确实打拳的是把对手啊，但是啊，就是观众朋友们看起来他这个随时就一期的拼拳，又是一腿，他没有说是很花哨的动作的变换，对，连续又是连续3腿，又是连续，是。 经常看到戏剧性的场面。刚才啊，这几腿踢上去就好比是踢到一个 从中间过去。对，大家看到从旁边的角度腿，从中间的拳，由中间的腿。马特要防他的这个腿。
And while it might seem counterintuitive to use this strategy, just think about how many animals in nature use it to great success. Like, sure, you could say a poison dart frog is being obvious, but that doesn't make it any less dangerous. Lion's fangs are pretty easy to see, but just pointing them out isn't going to make you any less eaten. And the same principle applies to fighting. For example, Conor McGregor has exactly one strike in his arsenal.
Again, nobody can take that left-hand shot.
But all knowing that does is preoccupy his opponent's mind, and that preoccupation leads to them doing exactly what he wants, which is standing exactly where he needs them to for him to land the punch that literally anyone could have told you was coming when the fight was signed. It's the same thing with Khabib's trip and smash, and some of the best fights of all time came out of specialist versus specialist matchups, where both fighters showed up with an, quote, obvious, yet ultimately still very high level game plan. I'd like to thank you for watching all the way through to the end. Hopefully you enjoyed this little adventure into the psychology of fighting, and maybe if you train yourself, you'll be able to apply some of the concepts that we covered in your own practices. Fight psychology is one of the most fascinating subjects to me personally, and if you feel the same way, please like, share, subscribe, and don't be afraid to leave a comment so I can produce better content for you in the future.